On October 14th, the regiment moved to a new location to an airfield near the Lithuanian town of Panevėžys. Part of the crews, having flown on a combat mission from Klopits, returned from the flight already on Lithuanian soil. The rest flew here, taking on board the airplane technicians, mechanics and motorists, hanging torpedoes on the holders. The day before, our troops had liberated Riga, the capital of Soviet Latvia, from the invaders. Despite a lot of trouble, a lot of urgent important matters related to relocation, Major Dobritsky turned around in full swing. In the squadrons held political informations, in the links communists and Komsomol members held talks. At the parking lots hung out battle flyers, on which I was able to see for the first time depicted by our amateur artists symbolic silhouette of the old town with its island-topped churches and spires, topped with cockerels. At that time I could not have imagined that the ancient capital of Latvia would become my second home for many years. We were settling in at the new airfield. With our flight here, the whole 8th Mine Torpedo Gachina Air Division gathered in one place 3 regiments of attack and 2 fighter regiments. This is strength. It is no longer spread fingers, but a powerful fist. We got the opportunity to interact with attack aircraft, and most importantly, we will now from takeoff to landing will be covered by new Yak-9s from based here fighter regiments, commanded by heroes of the Soviet Union P.I. Pavlov and A. Mironenko. What can be said, it was a reliable defense. Panevėžys is a small Lithuanian town. Southeast of it, the command of the Red Army on the eve of the war began the construction of a large airfield, but it could not be completed. Hitlerites did not use it at first, and when the front began to rapidly approach the Baltic, they needed new bases for aviation. The airfield was completed by the hands of Russian prisoners of war and Soviet people taken away into slavery, which was evidenced, for example, by the inscriptions stamped in the hardening mortar of concrete slabs Russians worked here. 12.04.44. Retreating, Hitlerites destroyed everything they could. They blew up service buildings, the runway. But our men of the construction battalion repaired the buildings in a short period of time, eliminated all other damages. The airfield allowed all 5 regiments to work normally. For us were prepared in advance parking places for airplanes in shelters, command post, rooms for personnel. In short, in comparison with Klopitsy, we settled here with comfort. The runway allowed us to take off even with a slight crosswind. Thus, the airplanes took to the sky immediately after turning out of the Caponiers onto the runway, and after landing and running, they were immediately directed to the shelter. Here on the Lithuanian soil, the aviators once again saw with their own eyes the traces of the atrocities of the Nazi atrocities. Not far from the airfield, Hitlerites built a huge camp for prisoners of war. Behind the barbed wire, in several rows, stood long-boarded barracks klopovniki, inside of which the bunks piled with rags and straw stretched in the floors. Along the perimeter of the camp, every 20 to 25 meters, there were observation towers with firing points and searchlights. But the most horrible sight was the moat in which 17,000 martyrs, Red Army soldiers, Jews and Lithuanians who did not submit were buried. At that time, as well as in the first post-war years, subversive terrorist groups created by bourgeois nationalists were operating in Lithuania. These gangs brutally murdered party and Soviet activists, as well as peasant new settlers. Thus, in the Kupiškis district of Lithuania, which was directly adjacent to the airfield from the east, nationalist gangs killed 80 peasants by the end of 1945. The picture of fascist captivity, atrocities of the enemies caused rage in the aviators, sacred hatred for the thugs, raised to the fight. In the regiment held party and Komsomol meetings, which discussed the tasks to increase vigilance, aimed personnel at excellent performance of combat tasks, clear organization of flights. However, the very beginning of combat activity at the new airfield was sad for us. The commander of the 1st Squadron, Andrei Lukic, Mikhailov, who had recently arrived to us from the ferry regiment, did not return from his first combat sortie. The weather that day was set as ordered low cloud, 200 to 300 meters, visibility 2 to 3 kilometers. Reconnaissance crews could not dream of anything better. And Mikhailov was assigned just such a task to go to sea near Palanga, to pass northward along the coastline, through Urbensky Strait and further through Riga, to make a reconnaissance of the weather as well as the presence of enemy ships on the sea communications. The crew was perfectly prepared for such a flight. Mikhailov was a participant of the war with the White Finns. Even then he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. He flew day and night without any restrictions. And then, shortly after takeoff, communication with him was cut off. His death was a terrible blow to me. We served together in the Pacific Fleet. I knew his mother Praskovia Andreevna, his wife Zoya Antonovna, and their little daughter Reichka, and I could not imagine how I could inform them about the death of their dearest man. And I couldn't not report it either. Mentally, I went over in my memory everything I said to Mikhailov before his tragic flight. Maybe something to blame me. Didn't say so, didn't specify, didn't clarify. Maybe I should have sent someone else. But Andrei Lukic, since he arrived in the regiment, has repeatedly hinted that he was ashamed to perform only training flights while his subordinates were flying combat missions. Was it right for me to refuse him? I looked for a reason in myself and didn't find it, but it didn't get any easier. The next day, October 15th, another blow fell on my head. A group of torpedo bearers of the 3rd Squadron, after performing a combat mission in the Baltic Sea, on the way back evaded the route, lost orientation and went to the front line of the Kurland group of Hitlerites. Here, the airplane of one of the wingmen, Lieutenant N.V. Ivanov, was shot down by anti-aircraft artillery fire. It is hard to lose men in battle, but even harder when people die accidentally, ridiculously, because of inexcusable negligence or mistakes of others. After all, if the navigator of the unit had not made a mistake, had not gotten lost, and the flight would have ended safely. And now 3 more funerals, 3 clots of bitter grief will go to the addresses, and, happy today, women will learn tomorrow that they are widows, and their children orphans. There was no limit to my indignation. My nerves were taut as strings. I didn't want to see or talk to anyone. "Let's go out for some air," the Chief of Staff suggested, noticing my condition. We went out of the command post hut, sat down on a nearby log, and were silent. The fresh breeze pleasantly cooled my face. We were silent, but everyone was thinking about the same thing: when will this damned war end? How many more young, blooming lives will its bloody millstones grind? I woke up cheerful and refreshed, as if there had not been 2 sorties with young pilots the day before to test piloting techniques in the dark, and then a long night vigil at the command post until the return of crews from mine laying. The grey dawn was oozing through the window. Only in the corners of the room the night darkness still lurked. The springs of Major Dobritsky's bed creaked, and I realized that he was awake too. "Get up, Grigory Vasilievich, you'll sleep through the whole kingdom of heaven." "What's your time?" 8:15. "Why is it still dark?" "It's autumn. The days are shorter, the nights are longer. It's not up to you and me." Yes, the daylight hours were decreasing catastrophically fast, and it made significant adjustments in the combat activity of the regiment. For several days the scouts did not detect any enemy convoys in the sea, and meanwhile new transports appeared in the port of Liepāja, which became the main supply base for the cut-off Kurland group of Hitlerites. It became clear that German convoys had time to pass the most dangerous areas in the dark time of the day, and during the day they stayed in the port under the protection of numerous air defense equipment. The division command demanded to strengthen night mine laying in Liepāja, Memel, Danzig Bay. After our losses in the regiment remained a limited number of crews trained for these tasks mine, and the crews of squadron commanders Major Kovalyov and Captain Meshcherin, of the young recruits, Junior Lieutenants VP, Polyushkin and VM Kulinik, who had recently arrived in the regiment, showed good results. It was urgent to train young people, and I asked Ivanov to plan me take-off flights almost every night. But it did not always work out. Once, reporting on the planned flights to the division headquarters, I heard, "You'll fly 2 or 3 times for mine laying, and then drive your pilots around until morning." At first I took it for a joke, but it turned out that there was no joke here. The situation demanded other actions. It remained to obey, to redirect the crews to fulfill the combat task. While they were loading mines on my plane, I escorted the crews of Kovalyov and Meshcherin into the night sky, and then flew out myself with navigator Sazonov and gunner radiator Lieutenant Vladimir Baikov who had recently arrived to us instead of Cherkashin to the post of Chief of Communications of the regiment. Not being able to destroy transports on the sea crossing at night, the Baltic Fleet Air Force Command decided to launch a combined strike on the port of Liepāja in the daytime. By the morning of October 30th, according to intelligence data, there were up to 15 transports, 2 destroyers, 2 patrol ships and 4 minesweepers. It was impossible to miss such an opportunity. The operation was developed and coordinated as carefully as 3 months ago, when the strike on the air defense cruiser Niobe was planned. First in the sky of Liepāja were to appear in the fighters of the 21st and 14th Air Regiments. Their task was to tie up the enemy fighters and give the 11th Attack Air Division's attack aircrafts a chance to suppress anti-aircraft fire in the port and on the ships. After that, the main blow to the ships, strike dive bombers of the 12th Bomber Regiment and 8 of our top Muscovite Army. The use of torpedoes was excluded, as the depth of the sea in the port, where the transport stood, did not exceed 10 meters. Therefore, preference was given to large-caliber high-explosive bombs. All of us, and the commanders of units, and ordinary pilots understood the complexity of the task according to the data we have. The port was guarded by 30 anti-aircraft batteries, which is about 120 guns. Not less anti-aircraft guns were also on the ships. In addition, the best air aces of Germany were sent to Liepāja by order of Hitler. On that day, as usual, after breakfast, pilots and navigators came to the command post to receive a combat assignment. Squadron commanders to stay, the rest to go out, announced the Chief of Staff. People moved to the exit, but then heard the voice of the navigator of the 2nd Squadron, N.P. Fedulova, who guessed, apparently, what will be discussed next. "No one needs to go out," he said. "We and the squadron commander Major Kovalev ask us to perform this task. The personnel are at the airplanes and waiting for orders," Major Kovalev added. "We ask the command of the unit to consider this flight as a gift of officers, sergeants and soldiers of the 2nd Squadron to the 27th anniversary of the Great October Revolution. This is how in the moments of severe trials the soul qualities of the Soviet people were revealed. Probably in each of us lives Gorky's Danko, ready to sacrifice himself for a great goal." I looked at the calm, courageous faces of Kovalev and Fedulov and realized that their decision was not matured now, that it was thought over and made earlier, when it became known about the upcoming operation. I read the respect for the courage of comrades on the faces of other pilots and navigators who stayed in the room. "Well, comrades," I said, "you take on a responsible and difficult task. Regimental command trusts you. We know that the 2nd Squadron fights steadfastly and courageously, but here, perhaps, to cross the threshold of the possible. So do it." A little while later, Ivanov, Dobritsky and I went to the parking lot of the 2nd Squadron. Here in a prominent place hung a colourful poster on which were printed the words of the remarkable teacher and writer as Makarenko: "Brave is not the one who is not afraid, but brave is the one who knows how to suppress cowardice." There can be no other bravery. Do you think that to go to death under bullets, under shells, means not to feel anything, not to be afraid of anything? No, it means to be afraid, to be tested, and to suppress fear. Squadron ready for flight, excess fuel drained. The reserve is 30% reported to me after checking the aircraft regiment engineer George Fedorovich Yakovlev. A few minutes later, engines roared mightily and 8 top Mostoviks one after another rose into the air. Realizing the importance of the operation, we at the last moment replenished Kovalev's group with experienced pilots from the 3rd Squadron. For the technical staff, and for all of us, the time of languid waiting began. We knew that there are no easy battles for torpedo carriers, but as it became known later, the battle at Liepāja was one of the most difficult. We realized this already when we watched the landing of our neighbors, who worked first. Attack planes, dive bombers, fighters, which had left for the mission in clear lines, were returning in disorderly groups, in pairs, or even alone. Finally, a familiar silhouette of a torpedo carrier appeared. 2 more landed after it, and then at 5-minute intervals 2 more went to land. In vain, straining our eyesight, we looked at the distant, blurred in the haze of the horizon the other 2 we never waited. The airplane of Major Kovalev, the leader of the group, did not return. We learned the details of that combat sortie from Nikolai Petrovich Fedulov. Here is what he said. After Palanga, torpedo carriers took a course in the sea and at a distance of 30 kilometers went north parallel to the coast. Already on the traverse of Liepāja saw the work of attack aircraft and dive bombers. In the water areas of the port and at its entrance bombs burst, ships were burning, dark smoke was rising upwards in a huge cloud, where many fighters were spinning in a deadly merry-go-round of air battles. Anti-aircraft artillery raged. On the suddenness of count-on no longer had to count, and at a distance of 12 to 15 kilometers from the coast torpedo bearers, two groups went to the outport. Prepare to attack. Commanded on the radio Kovalov. Planes rearranged and maneuvering entered the range of anti-aircraft installations. There was a terrible amount of fire, and when 8 more of our topmoskovikov opened fire, the sky turned into a living hell. Captain Fedulov, who had been in many vicissitudes before, assured me that he had never seen such fire. From the top of the hull, there was a resounding thump, as if a handful of peas had been pelted on the hull, and dust from bullet holes immediately swirled in the cabin. "We are under attack by a fighter," shouted gunner Radio Sergeant Pyotr Belchayev and ducked into the turret machine guns. But having given a couple of bursts, suddenly stopped firing. "You're not wounded? Why do not shoot?" shouted to him Fedulov. No order. Messer left with a turn to the left, didn't like it. Apparently went to look for easier prey. Shoot at the ships. Both groups made an organized attack, dropped bombs on the ships standing in the outport, and soon left the zone of fire. Nervous tension gradually subsided. "Boris Evgenievich, how are you?" Fedulov asked the commander over the intercom. "Everything is fine, except that none of the instruments on the dashboard does not work." "That's probably not the worst thing." Fedulov calmed down, began to scrutinize the aircraft. At first he thought that it seemed, but no, from the left engine glittered orange tongue of flame and disappeared, again appeared and again disappeared. And then the flames that had escaped into the open began to lick the airplane's skin. And behind them, bursting through the water columns and grey smoke spreading over the sea, flew the plane of Junior Lieutenant Kuzmin, engulfed in flames. Together with other wingmen, he followed the leader without leaving his place in the battle formation. Fedulov began to report what he saw to Kovalov and was silenced at half a word. The burning Boston exploded in the air. So died the death of the brave pilot Junior Lieutenant Alexander Yakovlevich Kuzmin, navigator Junior Lieutenant Fedor Sabarovich Amenkayev, and gunner Radio Sergeant Anatoly Yakovlevich Kuzmin. Fedulov decided not to report about the fire on his own airplane. Why? There was only one way out to land on the water, but in the location of enemy troops it was excluded. Not captivity. Better to share the fate of Kuzmin's crew. "Navigator, what shall we do?" "So we will not fly far," asked Major Kovalov, referring to the non-functioning instruments. "As soon as we pass the front line, we must land on the water. Then immediately report as soon as we pass. You can see for yourself. If you see flashes of gunfire, smoke, you won't be mistaken." "I see the front line," soon exclaimed the pilot. "Let's land." "Don't hurry, Boris Yevgenievich. If you can't see it from the rear cockpit, it means we haven't passed it yet." When the front line, glittering with fireflies of shots, billowing with smoke, floated under the wing, and by the silhouettes of cars and tanks, Fedulov was finally convinced that they really in the location of our troops. He reported about the burning engine to the commander and advised to land before it was too late. Boston sharply went down. After landing on the water, the plane crawled on its belly and, settling, caught on underwater rocks. Fedulov lost consciousness from the impact and came to himself only when he found himself in the cold water. The airplane was slowly sinking and something had to be done immediately. He tried to remove the turret cover to get out, but it would not open. After hitting the dashboard, Major Kovalov also lost consciousness for a while. When he began to realize what had happened, his first thought was of the crew. Were they alive? He climbed out on the plane, broke the turret lantern and the navigator's cabin lantern with his foot, helped Fedulov climb out on the wing. Then the two of them wounded, they pulled out Sergeant Belchayev, moaning with pain, whose leg was broken. According to their calculations, there were about 50 meters to the shore, but with a wounded comrade not to swim. "Stay here and I'll look for a boat and come back," said Kovalev, jumped into the water and swam to the shore. Boston sank in shallow water, thanks to which the top of the fuselage remained above water. Fedulov laid Belchaev so that he would not accidentally fall off, but he himself slipped and found himself in the water. The lifebelt was triggered and filled with warm air, so it seemed warmer in the water, even though his ounce had slipped off his feet and were floating nearby. Soon soldiers led by Major Kovalev appeared on the shore. They were dragging an inflated rubber boat to the water. A few strong rows and the rescuers are near. After a short treatment in the hospital, Captain Nikolai Fedulov began to work as assistant to the Chief of Staff of the regiment on intelligence. Major Boris Kovalev was promoted to another place of service. Sergeant Ivan Nikiforovich Belchaev did not return to the unit. In the raid on Liepāja, our topmost crews sank 3 transports with total displacement of 23,000 tons and 1 patrol ship. The crews of Major Kovalev, the leader of the group, Junior Lieutenants Bogachev and Repin, pilot Junior Lieutenant Sobolev worked best of all. "How is the mood in the 2nd Squadron?" I asked Major Dobritsky in the evening. "Strange people, our pilots," grinned Grigory Vasilievich. "Today they had a heavy battle. Before their eyes exploded Kuzmin's plane, wounded all 3 in the crew of the squadron commander, and they gathered in the dining room, telling funny stories and laughing. You should have listened to them ridicule the fascist soldiers. In youth people are more forgiving, not like us. In war, the most delicate souls get calloused, there's nothing you can do about it." But they gave October a good present. "A good one," repeated the deputy commander with pleasure. "We dedicated a special edition of the radio newspaper to them. Torpedo carriers, and then often visited the naval base in Liepāja, and, it must be said bluntly, each flight there can be equated to a feat. Especially I would like to note the daring raid of a group of topmast pilots under the leadership of the deputy commander of the 3rd Squadron, Lieutenant M.V. Borisov. Our pilots sank 3 enemy transports with total displacement of 16,000 tons. We had great success a week later, on December 22nd. This time the group of planes was led by the commander of the 3rd Squadron K.A. Mesherin. A large transport and 3 patrol ships were sunk in the outport of Liepāja. Our military historians will note later in strikes on the naval base of Liepāja, especially good results were achieved by topmast pilots of the 51st Mine Torpedo Aviation Regiment. In 3 strikes the share of the topmast gunners, who were only 21% of the total strike force, accounted for 75% of the total losses of enemy transports and ships ejected from the mainland of Estonia. The Nazis tried to hold on to the island of Saaremaa, but they were pressed here as well. Finally, in the hands of the enemy remained only a small piece of land in the southern tip of the island Cape Sõrve. This cape was of great importance for the group of armies north, as it allowed to keep under control the Urbensky Strait. Hitlerites strongly strengthened it, and, always having a tendency for propaganda purposes pompous, and lavishly named their defensive lines, gave it the name Urbensky Shield. Urbensky Shield, and indeed was a tough nut. Our ground units, forced to conduct an offensive on a very narrow section of the front, were deprived of the opportunity to maneuver, and frontal attacks led to heavy losses and were not effective, as the enemy's defence was deeply echeloned, to the limit saturated with various firepower. In addition, to strengthen the defence here came the 2nd Battle Group of the German Navy under the command of Vice Admiral Thiel. It included cruisers Admirals Scheer and Lutzow, as well as 6 destroyers. The ships shot through the narrow strip of Cape Sõrve from large-caliber guns, not allowing our fighters to raise their heads. In the sky, covering the ships constantly barraged several fighters. The command of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet developed a plan of operation against Thiel's group to help our advancing ground forces. It was entrusted to the 9th Air Assault Division, which was commanded by the hero of the Soviet Union, Lieutenant Colonel E.Z. Slipenkov. We were ordered to allocate a squadron of topmast pilots from 51 MTAP to Slipenkov's operational subordination. We consulted with N.I. Ivanov for a long time before deciding who to send to Parnu, where the attack aircraft were based. Finally, after a thorough analysis of the state of the equipment, staffing of personnel, their workload in combat work in recent days, we chose the 1st Squadron, which after the death of A. L. Mikhailov was commanded by Captain Ivan Dmitrievich Timofeev. Before arriving in the regiment, Timofeev worked as an instructor in an aviation school, then for some time was engaged in distilling airplanes. All the time he was eager to go to the front, and finally he achieved his goal. In the first sorties he showed extraordinary skill. Flying together with him Navigator Senior Lieutenant Alexei Sergeyevich Dekarev and Gunner Radiator, Chief of Communications of the squadron, Petty Officer Viktor Arsentievich Dekarev quickly worked with the commander, formed a combat crew. On its account, there was already one transport launched to the bottom and a large sea tugboat sunk in the Gulf of Riga. All three became holders of the Order of the Red Banner. To match the commander were also the commanders of units Senior Lieutenant VP Fomenko, Lieutenants AG, Gorbushin and VA Astukevich. In short, the choice seemed to us successful. "You have a good start," I said to Timofeev, familiarizing him with the new task. "You are a man of courage and determination. People follow you. That's why we entrust this difficult combat mission to you." "We will do our best to justify our trust, Comrade Major," answered Timofeev firmly. It is good when a man goes into battle with the realization that it is he who can cope with the case better than others, clearly representing all the danger, all the difficulties, preparing himself in advance to overcome them. We must. The decisive battles for Cape Sõrve began on November 18th. Low grey clouds were not only clinging to the tops of trees and continuously poured large thick snow, hampering the actions of aviation. Only after 5 days the weather improved and the sky above Parnu was filled with the roar of aircraft engines. Clear weather is good for walking, but it is no fun for torpedo carriers. Visibility to the horizon is practically unlimited, so surprise is out of the question. In addition, as already mentioned, in the target area barraged enemy fighters. The first to attack, wave after wave, went attack aircraft. Together with them acted Squadron P2, which led the hero of the Soviet Union Major K.S. Yusenko. Behind the attackers and dive bombers followed Timofeev's topmast pilots under cover of 12 Yak-9s. The route passed through the northern edge of Saaremaa Island, and then by sea to the estimated point west of the ships, with a subsequent turn and reorganization of the group in the left bearing. From the airfield to the first turn were at an altitude of 200 to 300 meters, then dropped to 30. Suddenly in the sea, to the right on the course, noticed an enemy seaplane taking off from the water, apparently a scout. A pair of fighters immediately broke away from the cover group, immediately attacked and shot it down. But the scout apparently had time to transmit a message about the appearance of our aircraft. Already after the second turn, the ships transferred all the fire, up to the guns of the main caliber, and now hit only on topmast of Ikami. Toward them stood a curtain of water columns, a collision with any of which threatened death. From above, several Messerschmitts rushed in front of the topmast of Iki, but our Yaks blocked their way and imposed an air battle, commanded Timofeev. The sea below boiled from the many bursts of large-caliber bombs. Black smoke clouds rose to the height. The crews recorded direct hits on the cruiser Lutzo, 2 destroyers and a fast artillery barge. Many years after the war, from the archives extracted the log of combat operations of the Army Group North, which found a record of how during November 23, 1944, at Cape Sõrve Soviet aviation sank 7 transports, 3 minesweepers, 2 self-propelled landing barges, 3 ferries and 5 boats. 4 minesweepers, many boats and barges were damaged, and a destroyer of T-23 type was put out of action. At nightfall, the enemy ships left to Gogland Island, and on the next day Saaremaa Island was completely liberated by our troops from German invaders. Urbensky Shield, the great hope of the German command, was broken. Timofeev's squadron returned to the regiment without losses. We met them as winners. We did not know exactly how many ships and transports they had sunk. And that was not the main thing for us. It was important that they worthily supported the glory of the 51st Tallinn. The Baltic autumn was gradually coming into its own. Clouds hung overhead with leaden weight, incessant rains with wet snow began to fall. The penetrating wind was getting even behind the collar of my flight jacket. Less and less often soared up the flares, calling for a flight on a combat mission. True, in the rare days of November still managed to briefly break out the weather, but the closer to winter, the less and less such lapses became. Autumn is not a time for flying. I kept hoping that weather conditions would improve in December, the first month of winter, but on the Baltic it is not much different from the rotten months of fall. How we all remembered our Russian winter, with its sparkling snow, hard frosts, and clear sunny days which we missed so much. The cold weather brought a lot of household chores. Dwellings, canteen, command post were being insulated. As the number of combat sorties was considerably reduced, it became possible to take our time to inspect and qualitatively repair our machines that had seen the sights. Sometimes we had to make 2 out of 3 airplanes, but we completely excluded failure of certain units. In the rain and snow, in the freezing wind, the technicians and motorists were working selflessly, putting their whole soul into the work. Their labour can be safely called a feat. Weather. It was a shame to realise that while we were forced to sit on land, enemy convoys were sailing freely at sea. Hitler's sailors must be happy about the bad weather. Therefore we tried to use the slightest brightening in the clouds, the slightest hope for better weather, given to us by weather forecasters, to the maximum. However, most of the crews flying on missions wrote in their combat reports the mission was not accomplished due to bad weather conditions on the route, landing with torpedo, no transports detected, bombs dropped on a backup target. Unfortunately, bad weather made its share in the lists of our losses. On December 16th, a group of planes headed by the deputy of the 2nd Squadron Ivan Antonovich Komlev received a combat mission to strike at the Nazi transports on the approach to Liepāja. However, the weather deteriorated sharply in the target area. In view of the fact that the group included young pilots, yesterday's graduates of schools, the leader made the right decision to return to the base. When we approached the airfield, we saw that it was covered with a dense shroud of snow. There was no visibility. Fearing for his inexperienced wingman, Captain Komlev did not land first, as it is supposed to the leader, and gave them the opportunity to land normally on the runway. But trouble awaited him. The airplane hit a snow charge, the crew lost orientation and the machine crashed into the ground. Together with IA, Komlev the navigator Lieutenant SM, Filanenko and the gunner radiator Sergeant MF, Drushinin died. We suffered the bitterness of this loss. Bad weather locked us firmly on the ground. There was a lot of free time and we tried to use it to improve the theoretical training of pilots and navigators. We organised classes by squadrons, attracted the most experienced staff officers, engineers, former teachers of aviation schools. With great benefit analysed past combat sorties, with a thorough review of the actions of the crews, held theoretical conferences. Bogachev's report on how he sank the 10th enemy transport was even discussed at an open party and Komsomol meeting. We planned and prepared these events, and in the evenings in the rooms where the crews lived, young people surrounded the old men and unplanned events began. And it is hard to say which ones were more effective and useful. Of course people are different. Some, perhaps, wanted to show off their new orders on their chests in front of the young it happened. But more often old people tried to tell something instructive. Not being afraid of dropping their authority in the eyes of young listeners, they told about mistakes, missteps, about trifles, which sometimes you do not pay attention to, and these trifles will turn out to be a disaster, or on the contrary, will serve as a magic wand. In short, they tried to protect their young co-workers from those unnecessary bruises and bumps which inexperience had once caused themselves. Once after dinner, on the way back to his place, we looked with Major Dobritsky in the location of the 3rd Squadron. In a large room, sitting and half lying on beds, pilots, among whom were several people recently arrived from the school, besieged. Navigator from the crew Bogachev Lieutenant Nikonko. Apparently, we did not get to the very beginning of the conversation, because Konko, a man unusually modest, who did not like to rant about his exploits, reluctantly fought back, probably going to get away with general phrases. I flew like everyone else. Nothing special. We looked for ships, found them, destroyed them. We got hit, though. Did you ever do that? Tell me. It happened, of course it did. You hit and they hit you. And you weren't wounded. Wounded. Twice. But as you can see, I'm alive. Comrade Wing Navigator. A boy's voice rang out. Tell us about the very first sorties. What did you feel? What was remembered? Nikolai Ivanovich was silent, gathering his thoughts, and then began. It was the 14th of September. We flew from the airfield Klopitsy Pair, leading Deputy Squadron Junior Lieutenant Sokolov, his wingman the commander of the Link Junior Lieutenant Nikolaev. Nikolaev had me as navigator, Sergeant Ivanov as gunner radio. Sokolov with a torpedo. We have bombs on board. There was no intelligence data. We had to search for ourselves. If we found the convoy, we were to attack and report the coordinates to the base. The identification signal I mined that day was rocking from wing to wing and one green rocket. We should be covered by yaks. We approached the Kapari airfield, where, ready for departure, were fighter escorts. I gave a green rocket. The fighters did not take off. I gave a second one again. They did not react in any way. I loaded the third missile, and I saw that the fighters took off. I put the loaded rocket launcher in one of the niches of my cabin, and of course immediately forgot about it. We established radio contact with the fighters. Negotiations were conducted in plain text. The call signs were rudimentary. They called us torpedo bomber, we called them yak. We flew at low altitude, 20 or 30 meters. The fighters have a small fuel reserve. These dragonflies are not for long-range flights, and soon they asked permission to return to the airfield. We had to let them go, although we were just approaching a dangerous area where we could not rule out a meeting with enemy fighters. In the area of Vindava we found a fascist convoy. A large transport was under guard of 2 patrol ships. Visibility was good. We saw them 30 kilometers away. And it seemed to us the enemy is very close. No wonder the first combat sortie, no experience. Sokolov, the leader, 20 kilometers before the target gives the command attack. At this command, as we were taught, Topmastovic at maximum speed went forward to fire machine guns and bombing attack on the guard ships to ensure a successful attack torpedo carrier. You already know that the scheme of interaction is designed so that the dropping of bombs Topmastovic and torpedo-launched torpedo carrier occurred simultaneously. We did not get it because we started the attack too far from the target. As a result, the ships concentrated all the fire on our plane. At the very moment of dropping bombs between the engine and the rear cockpit exploded shell. I felt a strong blow to my right side, but at first I did not pay attention to it because in the cockpit flares lit up. They were above the rear hatch. I quickly leaned over the hatch and began to tear off the cartridge case with the burning flares. With difficulty I managed to tear it off and throw it into the sea. While I was fiddling, we were out of the firing zone, and the enemy transferred all the fire to Sokolov's plane. He was approaching the torpedo drop point at minimum speed. The pilot could no longer maneuver and was a perfect target. From a direct hit, the airplane exploded in the air. Together with Sokolov, navigator Volodya Myasoidov and radio gunner Kolya Krishenyuk were killed. Busy with missiles, I did not see neither the bombs hitting the ship, nor the death of Sokolov's crew. Nikolaev shouted to me over the intercom about what had happened. Without wasting time, I grabbed an aviation camera and through the bottom hatch took several pictures of the convoy. After their manifestation on the ground, we clearly saw how, settling on the stern, sinking transport. I gave the pilot a course for the return route, and only then I had a chance to take care of myself. My right side was burning like fire. I swept my hand, it was covered with blood. Wounded. My eyes flashed, it seemed to begin to nauseate, and I was afraid to lose consciousness. Looking ahead, I'll say that the shrapnel hit my lower back and, by my luck, got stuck just before my spine. Looking up, I saw that Ivanov's right arm was hanging from the gunner radiator's turret and blood was running down it. I shouted, "Igor, are you alive? My arm was hit." He replied, "I can't move it. And the other one's fine. How are you feeling? Tolerable. We'll fly well. Don't tell Nikolaev. Let him fly safely." According to my calculations, it wasn't far to the airfield when Ivanov shouted, "There are 2 fighters coming in from behind," but I don't know whose I looked back. Indeed, we were taken in pincers by 2 stupid hawks. Whether they are Fox or benches, who knows, you can't tell from the front. They are catching up, their speed is faster than ours. Igor can't shoot with one hand, the flares are burned out. I shouted to Nikolaev to shake the plane from wing to wing, saying that I was my own. Nikolaev squeezed everything he could out of the machine. The speed was extreme. We saw how the oncoming airflow wrapped the torn edges of the plating on the holes. Still, the fighters were closing in on us, about to open fire. And then it hit me. The rocket launcher. It's loaded. I didn't have time to fire the third shot over Caporia. I grabbed the rocket launcher, stuck my hand out the hatch and fired. The fighters immediately turned away at the same time, and as they were making a turn, bright red stars flashed on their wings. It was theirs. Well, and then? They landed normally, on their own airfield. Only here Nikolaev learned that Igor and I were wounded. He himself, surprisingly, was not even hit. But the plane received 2 direct hits of 37mm shells in the nose and in the nacelle, and more than 150 shrapnel and bullet holes. It was my first victory, my first lesson in war. I beckoned Dobritsky with a look, and we went to our room. I knew that the youth would not let Konko go for a long time. Nikolai Ivanovich had a lot to tell. After a short treatment in the hospital, together with pilot Junior Lieutenant Alexander Bogachev and gunner radiator Igor Ivanov, they made up the most combat crew in the regiment. With each of their sorties, the number of sunk enemy transports and warships grew. The number of orders on Nikolai Ivanovich's chest also grew. More than once the award lists for Lieutenant N.I. Konko ended with the phrase worthy of a high government award, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. But he never had to wear the gold star of hero. Mine staging. And in the daytime you can't even see the socks of your own umbrellas because of the fog, and even at night. But even in that December inclement weather, the regiment was continuously receiving from the headquarters of the Fleet Air Force the assignments for mine laying. This was dictated by necessity. Not being able to use aviation for massive strikes on convoys, the command was looking for other forms of fighting them. Night we still had 1 or 2 and counting. Meshcherin, Timofeev, Borisov, Bogachev and myself, flying almost every night, quite tired. Therefore we continued to train newcomers from among the most experienced former ferrymen. At first we flew with them in the daytime, in conditions of limited visibility. In low and solid clouds, in snowfall, then we switched to flying in the dark. Gradually the ranks of night pilots were replenished, and it became easier for us, and all combat missions were carried out rigorously. In the last days of December, each mine, placed in the fairways of Liepāja, Vindava and Danzig Bay, was like a New Year's gift to the motherland. Of course we wanted to give merrier presents, brighter, with fireworks, with torpedo and bomb salutes in the Baltic, but the weather didn't allow it. For the New Year's dinner the tables were set in the club, a long boarded barrack, the most spacious room we could find. A Christmas tree was set up, and electricians beautifully illuminated it with coloured lanterns. Girls from the Airfield Maintenance Battalion decorated the walls and ceiling with garlands of coloured paper, fresh pine branches. In short, they tried to do their best to make everyone feel the holiday. Opening the New Year's Eve party, I briefly summarised the results of our combat activity for the past year, named the most distinguished officers, sergeants and soldiers, congratulated everyone on the coming year 1945, the year we all fervently believed in it, our victory. We also remembered our comrades in arms who gave their lives for the fatherland, whose graves we will not find in the vast expanses of the Baltic. And then we presented awards and memorable gifts, read out congratulatory telegrams of superior officers, watched pre-war movies, had fun, danced. Yes, we had no doubt that we were entering the last year of the war. Victory was in everyone's eyes. The enemy had been expelled from the entire territory of our country, except for a small piece here in Courland. The Red Army brought liberation to the peoples of Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia. The battles for the liberation of Hungary and Poland began. Ahead of us awaited heavy battles on enemy soil, and above all in East Prussia, an age-old hotbed of aggression. And we were ready for them. By the end of 1944, the German command, having weakened the combat composition of ships in other theatres of war, concentrated significant forces of its fleet in the Baltic Sea. This included 2 old line ships Schleswig-Holstein and Schlesien, 4 heavy cruisers Lutzow, Admiral Scheer, Prince Eugen and Seydlitz, 4 light cruisers, more than 200 submarines, up to 30 destroyers and destroyers, about 200 landing craft, 70 torpedo boats, 64 minesweepers, as well as a large number of patrol ships and boat trawlers. The main part of this fleet was based in ports and naval bases in the southern part of the Baltic Sea in Pillau, Danzig, Gdynia, Swinemundy. In Liepāja and Vindava there were minesweepers guarding the approaches to the bases and counteracting our aviation and submarines. Ensuring the safety of its fleet, coastal protection and support of ground forces, the enemy entrusted to the developed powerful coastal defence, equipped with large-caliber artillery and numerous anti-aircraft batteries. In addition, in the Baltic theatre of military operations based more than 500 enemy aircraft, mainly fighters. All this gave the enemy the opportunity to significantly strengthen the security of convoys on the passage to the sea and at anchorages. Even individual transports were often accompanied by destroyers, patrol ships and submarines. The situation at the fronts required to increase strikes on enemy ships. To this end, first attack aircraft, and with them our 3rd Squadron under the command of Capt. A. Mesherin, relocated to a small airfield near the Lithuanian resort town of Palanga. And a little later our whole regiment flew here. Now we did not have empty route flights over the territory occupied by the Nazis, and fighters could accompany us from takeoff to landing. Here we were, as if in the middle of the sea route between the ports of northern Germany and Liepāja, so that, barely having risen into the air, could soon already engage in combat. Among the advantages of the new location should be attributed to the fact that the terrain was familiar to the flight crew. We knew here every ravine on the ground, every single tree, every hamlet, because it was through this peculiar corridor between the Kurland grouping in the north and the front line in the south that we most often reached the sea communications and returned back to Panevėžys. Frankly speaking, the airfield was not quite convenient for torpedo carriers. Our heavy twin-engine airplanes could not really go wild here. Landing in bad weather, even in the daytime, let alone at night, was always risky. Well, what if the airplane was shot down? Besides, we were also worried about the proximity of the front. Hitlerites repeatedly gave us surprises in the form of intensive artillery fire from Memel. And soon after the relocation we received Guest's German fighter attack planes. Fortunately, they did not manage to make much trouble. Our yaks took to the air and the enemy had to get away. Now the bad weather was not so terrible for us. The sea was noisy nearby. The sorties for combat missions became more frequent. The enemy's losses became more tangible. Here are some excerpts from the reports of Sovinform Bureau of those days. For January 16th, the aviation of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet in the Baltic Sea sank 2 enemy transports of 1,400 tons displacement and a patrol ship. For January 17th, the aviation of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet sank an enemy transport of 7,000 tons displacement in the southern part of the Baltic Sea. And so almost every day. On January 28th, for example, pilots of our regiment sank an enemy transport with manpower and equipment on the approach to Memel. All airplanes returned to their airfield without serious damage. On January 29th, 3 transports with a total displacement of 16,000 tons and a self-propelled pontoon were sunk. The newspaper Pravda on February 2nd, 1945, published an article, "Transports Go to the Bottom." I would like to quote an excerpt from it. The reconnaissance has again discovered a large enemy caravan, which left the port of Liepāja. It consisted of 6 transports and guard ships consisting of a destroyer, a patrol ship, 3 minesweepers, and 8 fast-landing barges. A few minutes later in the air began to rise torpedo carriers 51st Mine Torpedo Air Regiment, which are on high alert. The first to fly out of the link, led by the commander of the link, Bogachev. The enemy opened a strong barrage fire. Junior Lieutenant Kulinich's airplane was hit by a direct hit of a shell on the way to the target. It seemed that disaster was inevitable, but it did not stop the brave pilot. On one working engine, in difficult weather conditions, maneuvering at low altitude, a young, without sufficient experience, torpedo bomber Victor Kulinich approached the target, comes to favorable angles, and hit the transport. and then brings the damaged airplane to its airfield and makes a landing. Junior Lieutenant Bogachev attacked the lead, heavily laden transport and let it go down. The second pair of Wing Commander Repin and pilot Polyushkin attacked a large transport, which went in the center of the convoy. From a direct hit of bombs and torpedoes, the transport caught fire and sank. After 40 minutes, at dusk, 2 more torpedo carriers took to the air the lead regimental commander Orlenko and wingman squadron commander Makarikin. When the crews approached the target, the caravan was already upset. Part of the ships remained to pick up people floating on the wreckage, the rest went full speed to the southwest. Targets were distributed as follows: the leading attacked the lead transport, which went in the first group of the divided convoy and sank it. Makarikin attacked the end transport of the second group. His attack was also successful. And only the onset of darkness and thickening fog over the sea prevented the complete defeat of the enemy convoy. And the very results of combat sorties, and the fact that the actions of the regiment noted the main newspaper of the country, brought deep moral satisfaction. Appreciating the actions of our old men and gaining experience young people, I was especially pleased for Captain Makarikin. Fyodor Nikolaevich arrived to us just on the eve of October holidays. At one time he worked in Yeisk Aviation School, and there he gave a ticket to the sky to some of our pilots, including Bogachev. Then he served together with them in the regiment of ferrymen. Therefore, having met many old acquaintances in our regiment, he easily and quickly joined the team. We appointed him commander of the 2nd Squadron instead of Major Kovalev, who left after being wounded. So that flight to intercept a convoy was his second, and immediately such a success. And soon we won another big victory here. Transport and tanker under the protection of several warships were coming to Liepāja. To cover the caravan from Liepāja rose to 24 fighters. The enemy especially protected the tanker Zasnitz, which, as it turned out later, was carrying 5,000 tons of fuel, extremely necessary for tanks and other military equipment. Our fighters from the 21st Air Regiment tied the fight Fokkers, and Messerschmitts attack aircraft suppressed the fire of anti-aircraft artillery ships. The commander of the link, E.D. K. Bashev with a torpedo and his wingman V.G. Martinov and A.A. Brovchenko with bombs sunk 2 minesweepers from the guard, and then a pair of torpedo carriers headed by A. Bogachev sent Zasnitz to the bottom of the sea. Pilots of the 15th Reconnaissance Regiment gave us a whole series of good photos from the moment of detection of the Zasnitz to its sinking. Here it goes serenely accompanied by guards, and here plunges into the abyss of the sea. On January 28th, our troops captured Memel. For active participation in the capture of such an important port and city, courage and bravery shown by the Supreme Commander-in-Chief announced to all the personnel of the regiment a commendation. After the liberation of Tallinn and then Pärnu, it was the 3rd commendation of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. But the main thing was that for this operation the regiment was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. On the purple velvet of the native 51 MTAP, the first combat order glowed. So the victorious year of 1945 started successfully for us. It became known that at one of the berths of the Memel port a German transport, heavily damaged by our aviation, was moored. This is already interesting. We consulted Ivanov and Dobritsky. It would be good to take our Eagles there to show the ship deck superstructures, location of anti-aircraft installations, to determine its strengths and weaknesses. How it will come in handy in future attacks. It was a sin to miss such a training aid, and even in life size. We loaded into the cars and drove from Palanga to the south, along the coast. The weather was usual Baltic weather fog, wet snow and rain. Under the wheels slippery asphalt, in many places disfigured by tank tracks. Everywhere craters from bombs and artillery shells. We passed the defence lines 1, 2nd, 3rd, torn multi-row barbed wire fences, blown up anti-tank bulwarks, destroyed and in some places survived hastily abandoned by Hitlerites during the retreat pillboxes and bunkers. There are a lot of them. We saw with our own eyes how difficult it was for our soldiers to take these powerful fortifications. In some places there were still lying untidy corpses of enemy soldiers and officers, conquerors of the world. With bitterness, we looked at the once picturesque area disfigured by fascists. Once people were enjoying life, enjoying the fruits of the bountiful land, but now the war had gone through here with a giant hammer. Finally, we reached Memel. To us, accustomed to high speeds, these 25 kilometers seemed like a road to eternity. The city is badly destroyed. On the outskirts, instead of houses, there are only smoky chimneys. In the center, large buildings are either completely destroyed or mined. Our sappers diligently extracted mines and immediately disarming them, stacked them. An elderly sergeant, a squad commander, told us that Hitlerites mined everything they could, household items, and even children's toys when retreating. It cost someone his life. Here it is, the beastly grin of fascism. Residents met rarely. Retreating, the Nazis took the population with them. The streets are so blocked that it's hard to pass. The harbour. At the quay wall is really moored, heavily damaged by our aviation German dry cargo, which failed to leave. The ship is loaded with grain, looted by the invaders in the Soviet Baltic. A huge torn hole in the very centre of the ship was conspicuous. They cut his belly. Pilot Junior Lieutenant Victor Nosov exclaimed enthusiastically, but it's not clear what it was hit with, a torpedo or a bomb. It was a good hit, right in the centre, in the heart. Sasha, don't you recognize it? Not your job? Someone teased Bogachev. Mine don't go back to the port. Mine are there, Bogachev argued, nodding towards the sea. Still, I wonder why there are such gates in the board, from a bomb or from a torpedo. An argument ensued. Torpedo bearers claimed that the hole was made by a torpedo. Topmastmen proved their own. What's the difference? Major Dobritsky reconciled the disputants. That's not the point. The main thing is that the torpedo or bomb was ours, Soviet. We went up on deck. Everywhere torn iron, mangled, twisted metal structures, silenced forever anti-aircraft guns with punctured knurls and slid down the barrels. These ones fired back. Yes, it would be hard to envy those who were here during the torpedo attack. Going across the deck practically sorted out a lot of questions. How, for example, the pilot to pass close to the ship at low altitude so that the enemy could not use all anti-aircraft installations for firing. What deck superstructures restrict the enemy from firing when attacking a torpedo carrier? How vulnerable are the calculations of anti-aircraft guns and installations from the fire of our large-caliber machine guns? Interested in many things. And it is encouraging that there were no bored sightseers among us. All pilots and navigators actively participated in getting acquainted with the ship, in the discussion of the issues raised, expressed their judgments, argued their point of view. An hour and a half flew by unnoticed. I summarize the results of this unusual practical lesson. We have learned something. That's the main thing. It's time to return to the airfield. On the way home we exchanged our impressions. Meanwhile the fog had cleared, and the hulls and masts of sunken enemy ships in shallow water could be seen on the sea. Our native aviation has worked hard, said Victor Nosov, and in his voice sounded proud notes. Memel is ours. Now Königsberg is next. They say it's a hard nut to crack, echoed Bogachev. You can't take it with bare hands. Nothing will work. There was silence under the wind-swept awning of the car. Everyone was thinking about his own, whether about what he had seen in the port, or about the new tests to come. Each day of combat work was not like the previous one, but invariably late in the evening, and sometimes well past midnight, unless mine-laying flights were planned, when the results for the past 24 hours were already summarized, the tasks for the next day were set and people were resting. I had some free time. Sometimes I just wanted to be alone, relax, distract myself, give my head a rest, write a letter to my wife and children. That November evening I sat down at my desk with such intentions. But I had a stack of bulletins that I had not had time to look through during the day, orders and instructions for the regiment to be signed. Tomorrow they were to be executed, so it was not good to postpone for later. Nearby 3 skinny cardboard folders, personal files of graduates who arrived from the school, a whole crew flown in the school. In the morning I'll personally get acquainted with these guys, but for now it's better to look through their profiles, biographies, performance characteristics and attestations in advance tomorrow. It will get rid of unnecessary questions. Personal file of the pilot Junior Lieutenant Viktor Petrovich Nosov. The photo shows a handsome, snub-nosed boy with a smart look, a smooth face, and a boyishly swollen upper lip. The autobiography is short. Like his life itself, Victor is a little over 20. In my 37, I was fatherly afraid for him. The boy's life is just beginning, and soon the war will require him to go into the fire, into the thick of it. And he will go, exposed to every moment of mortal danger. Biography, in general, typical for young men of his age. Son of an old communist, Komsomolets. After the 8th grade, he entered the factory communication school. He combined his studies with work at the radio station. He was a Stakhanovite. When the war began, without waiting for conscription, he submitted an application to the district military enlistment office with a request to be sent to an aviation school. The request was granted. At first he studied in Stalingrad School of Civil Air Fleet, and in 43rd he was sent to the military aviation school named after Livanovsky, from where after graduation to us. That's the whole biography. Already later, when in everyday communication our relations lost the official character of relations between the chief and the subordinate, some details of Victor's biography were revealed, which completed his portrait. In his native Senjalai, where he was born and grew up, he was a leader of the guys from his street. He was not afraid of anyone and anything. He liked to sit for hours with a fishing rod on the bank of the Volga. He swam well and, to the envy of many, bravely jumped swallow from a high Volga slope. In the evenings he read a lot, especially liked books about pilots. The portrait of Valery Chakhlov invariably hung over his bed. And in school and in FZU he studied well, enjoyed authority among his comrades, always stood up for girls. The more I got to know Victor, the more sympathy I felt for him. I wasn't the only one. The personal file of Navigator Junior Lieutenant Alexander Igonin is as thin as that of the crew commander autobiography, questionnaire, Komsomol characterization, certification for the award of the primary officer rank. Igonin is a Permian. The beginning of the war caught him in the 6th grade. Like all boys, he was eager to go to the front, but his older brother Alexei went to the front, and Sasha replaced him in production. Here his aptitude for exact sciences, his attraction to technology manifested itself. Old masters predicted his engineering future, and he dreamed of aviation. And suddenly misfortune, he injured his leg. Sasha could not give up his dream of the sky. In order to eliminate the consequences of injury, he took to sports, even played soccer. There, at the plant, joined the Komsomol, and a little later he was elected a member of the district Komsomol committee. He volunteered for the army. He, like Nosov, easily and quickly joined our team. Sasha loved and could sing, and maybe that's why he reminded me so much of the dead Joseph Sachko, who constantly lived in my memory. True, Igoshin's repertoire was quite different. Most often he sang his favorite song about a Rostov boy who died protecting his pigeons from fascist bullets. In his performance I heard for the first time a song about how a British soldier smoked a self-twist of Russian makhorka, and a Russian sailor smoked a British cigar. Igoshin would start singing, and the room would quiet down. They listened to him willingly. And the autobiography of a gunner radio sergeant Fyodor Dorofeev turned out to be quite short. At the age of 17, having barely graduated from FZU in Novosibirsk, he volunteered for the army. He asked to join the aviation. The request was granted. In the school named after Livanivsky, for the first time met with Nosov and Igonin. Together, with Major Dobritsky, we accepted our new Komsomol crew. They entered timidly, stretched out at attention, but introduced themselves clearly, in full uniform. New uniforms, snow-white cuffs on their tunics, buttons and boots polished to a shine. They tried to keep up their good manners, and yet they were worried, sometimes answering inappropriately. Grigory Vasilievich, and I understood their condition. We had once gone through it ourselves. Having solved all the issues with their living arrangements and assigning them to the 2nd Squadron, we let them go, knowing from experience that today and tomorrow and in all the following days will not once have the opportunity to talk to each other in an off-duty environment. which is much more useful than an official presentation. "Well, what do you think of the boys?" I asked, when the door closed behind them. "They're a sight to behold," vividly responded Grigory Vasilievich, but in his voice clearly audible sadness. He was silent, staring blankly out of the window, but I guessed what he was thinking. It was his heavy duty to write to his parents about the fact that the crew their son had flown in had not returned from a combat mission. Grigory Vasilievich, being a father himself, was terribly worried, sitting down for such a letter. Perhaps now Sokolov, Pudov, Ivanov, Mifakudinov and their crews stood before his eyes. They were young, too. And look, he spoke again. 3 of them, all so different, but all 3 of them had the same thing on their minds: they wanted to go into battle right away. That's how it is with us. Love for the motherland is absorbed with mother's milk, and they will fight for it. They'll fight badly. But, as we always did with graduates of schools, we were in no hurry to release Nosov and his crew into battle. The first and last tragic September flight of Sokolov's crew was too fresh in our memory. School flight practice is one thing. It is only the first steps into the sky, the foundation for the further formation of an air fighter. Another thing, the battle. Nosov, we must give him credit, as a pilot and crew commander, well understood that the success of the battle and the fate of the crew depends on mastering the tactics of torpedo aircraft, from mastering the Boston. And he studied diligently, greedily absorbed every word of the commander of the link, squadron commander, tested by fire, and yet he was losing patience. "Well, comrade captain," he tormented Makarikin, "send on a combat mission." "It's early. It's still early." The squadron commander was adamant. "The war is ending, comrade captain. We won't have time to fight." "Yes, you will. You've had your share of fascists. Let's fly to the range one more time, practice the anti-aircraft maneuver. Then we'll see." "Don't hurry, learn more," advised the pilots who had already been admitted to combat work and had 1 or 2 combat missions under their belt. "Everything is not so easy there as it seems from here. Before you can say, 'Mum, you'll be hit,' you'll learn." "I won't get hit. If I get hit in the target area, I'll ram you. I won't turn away, don't worry." He spoke so passionately and convincingly that one could believe that he wouldn't back down. On the traverse of Palanga, not far from the shore, there was a sunken enemy ship lying on the ground. Only the tops of its masts were sticking out above the water, and until the autumn storms broke them completely, we used them to practice the skills of topmast bombing and anti-avoidance maneuvering. Squadron commanders took out young recruits here. Finally, in December, Viktor Nosov's crew, as part of a group of airplanes, took a baptism of fire in the Baltic skies. It was not quite successful. The crew failed to hit the target. It was not very upsetting. It was rare for anyone to succeed in the first combat flight. The important thing was that the crew returned to their airfield unharmed. This is not so little, and there would be more victories. And so it happened. Here is an extract from the information about the combat activity of the pilot of the 2nd Squadron of the 51st MTAP, Nosov VP, on December 22, 1944 in the port of Liepāja. Personally sank a patrol ship on February 5, 1945 in the Baltic Sea. In a group sank a transport of 7,000 tons displacement, for which he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Battle. In a letter to his parents, Victor shared the most intimate things. "I was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. I think that not the last. The situation at the front is good, so I will see you soon. I wish I could see you, talk to you." But Victor never got the chance to see his relatives again. It was early morning on February 13th. The grey sky has no light, the weather is obviously not flying. But the work in the regiment is still going on. The order to take off may come at any minute. In high readiness for the flight, a group of Deputy Commander of the 2nd Squadron, Senior Lieutenant V. P. Fomenko. In its composition, the crews of the Wing Commander G.G. Inikiv, pilots Lt. P. Nosov and Junior Lieutenant P.N. Koltashenko. On the airplanes, Fomenko and Inikiva torpedoes, the other 2 bombs. The headquarters receives various orders, reports, bulletins, And here are the data of aerial reconnaissance on the movement of the enemy convoy: 3 transports and 2 ships under the cover of bad weather moving course to the northeast. And then at once the staff cars spun. Chief of Intelligence Major M. Semilov put the data on the map and agreed on the interaction with the fighter's cover. The first Deputy Chief of Staff Capt. Chernik makes a route calculation of the flight, the senior engineer of the regiment Captain Aviation Technical Service. AI Medvedev with specialists goes once again to check the readiness of the material part. Meteorological Service reports weather map. On the reliability of ground and air communications took care of the Chief of Communications Regiment Senior Lieutenant V.V. Baikov. All data from the specialists come to the Chief of Staff N. I. Ivanov to report to me. Ivanov to report to me, the regiment commander. Only having them, I will be able to make the right decision and set a combat mission to Fomenko's group. Safety via Lithuania from places of shelter and safe takeoff squadron provides Squadron Commander Captain F.N. Makarikin. At 13 hours 34 minutes, the silence of the airfield shook the hum of engines, and heavily loaded aircraft one after another rose into the air. The navigator of the leading plane, Lieutenant G. Chernyshev, gave the pilot a course to the meeting point with the convoy. The wingman quickly joined the leading plane, and behind and a little higher than them, as far as the height of the clouds allowed, the cover fighters took their place. A Yak-9 squadron under the command of Senior Lieutenant Gotolsky from the 21st Fighter Regiment. We, as they say, always understood each other half-heartedly, and now the fighters did not keep us waiting. This time we did not conduct additional reconnaissance of the target. P-2 reconnaissance airplane of pilot Topanov, who found the convoy remained above the target. Now its task was to point a strike group at it and record the result of the attack, so there could not be a misfire. At the point of combat deployment on the command prepare to attack, the group dispersed in pairs. Fomenko chose the lead transport, and Koltashenko provided him with an exit to the attack. Yenikiev targeted the end one. It was a 2-tube, 2-masted steamer. Its sides were only 2 to 3 meters above the water, apparently. The Nazis loaded it to the limit, bringing reinforcements to the divisions in Kurland. At the command attack, Nosov increased engine speed, went ahead of Yenikiev. Dark figures on the decks swarmed, flickered, and from there a shower of fire poured towards the planes. Intersecting and diverging, around the planes swarmed bright traces of automatic guns, Ehrlichen. Bursts of anti-aircraft shells, giant water columns rose out of the water. Throwing the plane up and down, from side to side, Nosov poured machine gun bursts on the decks of the ships and rapidly approached the intended point of dropping bombs. It was necessary at all costs to get close enough to drop exactly there, no longer and no closer. A few seconds more, and the fate of the transport would be sealed. The enemy ship, bristling with shots, was about 700 meters away when Nosov's Boston caught fire from a direct hit of a shell. It burst into flames at once, like a torch, and the pilot directed his burning torch with bombs directly into the side of the ship. A huge column of flame and smoke rose upward, and the 8,000-ton transport began to settle rapidly aft. The descending black smoke covered the remains of the heroes like a mourning blanket, and the harsh Baltic took them into its embrace. No one knows the words which, as the last handshakes, were exchanged in the separated cockpit of the burning airplane Victor, Nosov and his glorious comrades in arms. No one knows what the commander said to his crew and what navigator Alexander Igoshin and gunner radiator Fyodor Dorofeev answered him. But he who fought in the same formation with Nosov over the grey waves of the Baltic, he heard these words through the rumble of battle. "If they hit the target, I'll go for a ram." It was the first transport ramming by a heavy aircraft in all the previous years of the Great Patriotic War. The heroic crew of V. Nosov in his 6th combat flight fulfilled the sacred duty to the motherland. In that battle Fomenko sank another transport and Koltashenko a patrol ship. But the joy of victory was overshadowed, and they looked with pain in their hearts into the grey waves of the Baltic, where their battle friends found their last shelter. Late in the evening, when the task of the day was fully completed, put in hiding and camouflaged aircraft, the flight crew gathered, as usual, at the command post for a debriefing. But the debriefing did not work out. The wound was too fresh and bleeding, And our service meeting itself turned into a morning meeting, where each of the pilots, navigators, gunner radiators angrily swore to avenge the death of combat comrades in arms. As long as the eyes see the enemy to sink. As long as his hands hold the helm to sink. As long as the heart beats to the bottom of the fascist vultures. On February 15th, Sovinform Bureau informed the Soviet radio listeners about the unprecedented feat of the Komsomol crew, describing it as self-sacrifice in order to fulfill the combat mission. Feats of heroes forever remain in the grateful memory of the people. In the town of Sengilai, Yulovska region, on the high bank of the Volga, on the square in front of the river station, there is a bust of the hero on a pedestal. The inscription under it reads to Viktor Petrovich Nosov, a hero of the Great Patriotic War, from the youth of the district. This monument was erected on the funds collected by Komsomol members and youth. A bust of Viktor Nosov is also erected near school No. 1, where he studied. In the name of V, Nosov named streets in Sengilai, in the city of Stavropol, where he once worked, and in the city of Kaliningrad. In the aviation of the Navy established a prize named after Viktor Nosov. And the memory of I. Igoshin is imprinted on a memorial plaque installed in one of the shops of the Perm plant, named after Dzierjinsky, where the hero worked before going to the front. In the center of Palanga, where the crew left for their last flight, a memorial stele in memory of those who died for the liberation of the city was erected in the military cemetery. Among others, the names of V. P, Nosov, A, Igoshin and F, Dorofeev are inscribed in the stone forever. I, and Dorofeev I. Our Polish friends also honor the memory of their liberators. If you happen to pass by sea along the Polish coast, you will see an obelisk pointing to the sky on the steep Cape Rozu, on Hawk Mountain near the ancient town of Pucka in the Gdansk province. It was not far from this place that our torpedo boat heroes performed their immortal feat. Tens of thousands of tourists from many countries of the world come here to worship the heroes and lay flowers. With excitement we read the inscription. To Soviet pilots. Viktor Nosov, Alexander Igoshin, Fyodor Dorofeev, who on February 13th, 1945, died a heroic death for our and your freedom, citizens of Putsky district. Over the years, a sad but kind tradition has developed every year on May 9th, Victory Day. People come to the shore, go out to sea in boats and lower wreaths of spring flowers covered with scarlet ribbons onto the water, so that the waves, mute and impartial witnesses of history, would carry them to the place where the faithful sons of our people, who died in a hard fight with the worst enemy of mankind, fascism, rest on the seabed. The memory of them lives in the song. The surf was hushed at granite piers, and the seagulls were silent over it. When we, bowing over the bright water, we lowered the cherished wreath, floating on the crest of the wave. The wreath floats on the salty plains, where the heroes of war, fallen in battle, are left forever in the depths of the sea. Their deeds live on in legend and song. In the hearts of young generations, they call the youth to new exploits, in the name of heroic accomplishments.